The mist rolls in from the Atlantic on this October evening, creeping across the Irish countryside like the fingers of the dead seeking purchase on the world of the living. You stand at the edge of the ancient cemetery outside Galway, where headstones bearing names like O'Brien, McCarthy, and Fitzgerald lean at impossible angles, weathered by centuries of wind and rain. The silence is absolute, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the cliffs and the whisper of wind through the gnarled hawthorn trees. Then you hear it. At first, it might be mistaken for the wind itself, a low keening that seems to emerge from the very stones beneath your feet. But as the sound grows stronger, more focused, more undeniably human, you realize with growing horror that this is not the wind. This is a voice, a woman's voice, raised in a lament so filled with grief and supernatural knowledge that it makes your soul ache with sympathetic sorrow. The keening rises and falls in patterns that your mind recognizes but cannot understand, following musical scales that predate written history, carrying words in a language that died out before the Romans ever set foot in Ireland. This is not a song of the living, but a dirge for the dying, a funeral hymn that announces the approach of death itself. You know with the certainty that comes from ancestral memory buried deep in your genetic code that someone in your bloodline is about to die. And the voice that brings this terrible news is not human, but something far older, far more connected to the mysteries of life and death than any mortal woman could ever be. This is the cry of the Banshee, Ireland's herald of death, the supernatural mourner whose appearance has foretold the demise of Ireland's great families for over 1,000 years. But what is this creature that Hollywood has reduced to a shrieking ghost in white robes? Where does she come from? And why do the old stories insist that her lament is not a curse, but a blessing? A final act of love from the spirit world for those whose time has come. To understand the true nature of the Banshee, we must leave behind the sanitized ghost stories of modern entertainment and journey into the heart of Ireland's most ancient and sacred traditions. We must explore the wild landscapes where the boundary between life and death was always thin, where the spirits of the ancestors never truly departed, and where certain women were chosen to serve as bridges between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Tonight, we unmask the death herald that Hollywood got wrong. Tonight, we meet the real Banshee. Chapter 1. The Ancient Keening, born from Ireland's primal grief, or Our investigation into the true nature of the Banshee begins not in the realm of supernatural horror, but in the most fundamental human experience, the confrontation with death and the need to transform grief into something sacred and meaningful. In ancient Ireland, death was not the sanitized, medicalized process it has become in the modern world, but a cosmic event that required the intervention of specialists trained in the sacred arts of mourning and spiritual transition. The earliest references to what would later be called the Banshee appear in the ancient Irish legal text known as the Brehon Laws, dating back to the 7th century. These documents, written in Old Irish and preserved in monastic manuscripts, describe a class of women known as the Bean Chawanta, literally the Bean Cawant keening women, who held a crucial position in Irish society as professional mourners and spiritual guides for the dying. According to Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan, a professor of Celtic studies at Trinity College Dublin, who has spent 20 years translating these ancient texts, the Bean Chanta were not simply hired performers, hereditary practitioners of a sacred art that required extensive training in genealogy, music, and what the texts call the knowledge of the crossing. These women could trace the bloodlines of Ireland's great families back through countless generations, and they possessed the spiritual authority to determine who was worthy of the full ritual honors of death. The Brehon Laws describe the keening ritual in detail that reveals its profound spiritual significance. When a member of one of the great families was approaching death, the Bean Chawanta would be summoned to begin the process of spiritual transition. This was not simply a matter of mourning the dead, but of actively facilitating the soul's journey from the physical world to the other world of the ancestors. The ritual began with what the texts call the calling of the names, in which the Bean Chawanta would recite the complete genealogy of the dying person, invoking the spirits of all their ancestors to come and guide the departing soul safely to its destination. This genealogical recitation could continue for hours, as the keening woman traced bloodlines back through hundreds of years of Irish history. But the most crucial aspect of the ritual was the lament itself, a form of musical composition that the ancient texts describe as being given by the spirits, rather than created by human artistry. The Bean Chawanta would enter a trance-like state in which she claimed to receive the melody and words directly from the other world, creating a unique song of mourning that captured the spiritual essence of the departing soul. Dr. Fiona McCarthy, an ethnomusicologist at Trinity College Dublin, who has studied surviving recordings of traditional Irish keening, explains that these laments follow musical structures that are unlike any other form of Irish traditional music. The scales used are pentatonic, suggesting connections to very ancient musical traditions, and the rhythmic patterns correspond to what musicologists call breath rhythms, based on the natural cycle of human respiration. Most significantly, the keening contains what Dr. McCarthy calls prophetic elements, musical phrases that seem to predict or announce future events, rather than simply mourning past ones. Analysis of historical keening texts reveals that the Bean Chawantes often incorporated information about the manner, time, or circumstances of death that they could not have known through normal means. One of the most detailed accounts of ancient keening practice appears in the Annals of the Four Masters, compiled in the 17th century, but drawing from much older sources. The Annals describe the death of Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland, at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. According to this account, the keening for Brian began 3 days before the battle, when a Bean Chawanta named Áofa ní Flanagan appeared at the royal camp, claiming to have received a vision of the king's impending death. Áof's lament, portions of which are preserved in the Annals, contains remarkably specific details about Brian's death: the time of day it would occur, the weapon that would kill him, and even the name of his killer. When these predictions proved accurate, Aoif's keening was considered so spiritually powerful that it was memorized and passed down through generations of traditional singers. The Annals also describe Aoif's appearance during the keening ritual in terms that would later become associated with Banshee encounters. She is described as wearing a gray cloak that seemed to shift and change in the firelight, with hair so long it reached the ground and eyes that reflected light like those of a nocturnal animal. Most significantly, witnesses reported that her voice seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously, as if she were being joined by invisible companions. The transition from human Bean Chawanta to supernatural Banshee appears to have occurred gradually, as Ireland's ancient Gaelic society came under pressure from Viking invasions, Norman conquest, and English colonization. As the great Irish families lost political power and social cohesion, the hereditary keening women found their traditional roles disappearing. Many of the ancient bloodlines died out or were scattered, leaving no one to carry on the sacred knowledge of the crossing. According to folklore collected by Lady Augusta Gregory in the late 19th century, some of the Bean Chawanta chose to continue their sacred duties even after death, becoming spirit entities bound to their ancestral families through supernatural rather than earthly ties. These ghostly keening women retain their knowledge of genealogy and their ability to perceive approaching death, but they now manifested as supernatural beings rather than living human practitioners. The term Banshee itself appears to be a corruption of the original Irish Bean Sida, meaning woman of the fairy mounds or woman of the other world. This linguistic evolution reflects the transformation of the Bean Cawante from human specialists into supernatural entities associated with the Sidi, the fairy folk who were believed to inhabit the ancient burial mounds scattered throughout the Irish landscape. Brother Columba O'Connell, a Franciscan monk who compiled folklore in County Cork during the 16th century, wrote that the transformation from Bean Chante to Bean Sidi occurred because the old ways required continuation, and when the living could no longer serve, the dead took up the burden. His chronicle suggests that the Banshee tradition represented not a corruption of ancient practices, but their supernatural preservation in the face of cultural destruction. The ancient keening tradition established several characteristics that would remain consistent in Banshee encounters throughout the centuries. The connection to specific bloodlines and family genealogies, the ability to predict death before it occurred, the use of supernatural music and voice, and most importantly, the function as a spiritual guide rather than a harbinger of evil. The Banshee was not a demon or monster, but a sacred mourner whose appearance represented the continuation of Ireland's most ancient spiritual traditions in supernatural form. Chapter 2. The Three Faces of Death, the Banshee's Changing Forms. As the Banshee tradition evolved from its origins in ancient keening practices, the entity began to manifest in multiple forms that reflected different aspects of death and different relationships with the families she served. These manifestations were not random variations, but represented distinct spiritual functions that corresponded to the diverse ways in which death enters human experience. The most complete description of the Banshee's various forms appears in the manuscript known as the Leabhar na Huidre, or Book of the Dun Cow, compiled at the monastery of Clonmacnoise around 1100. This text, written in medieval Irish, contains what appears to be a systematic catalogue of supernatural entities associated with death and prophecy, including detailed descriptions of three primary Banshee manifestations. The first form, described in the manuscript as the Bean Sharan, or Weeping Woman, appears as a young maiden of extraordinary beauty, dressed in flowing robes of silver or white. Her hair is typically described as reaching to her ankles and possessing an otherworldly luminescence that allows her to be seen clearly even in complete darkness. This manifestation of the Banshee appears to families with whom she has particularly close connections, often those whose bloodlines she has served for many generations. The Bean Sharan's lament is characterized by what the manuscript calls the music of sorrow made beautiful, a form of keening that transforms grief into something approaching transcendent art. Witnesses describe her voice as possessing multiple tones simultaneously, creating harmonies that seem impossible for a single singer to produce. The emotional effect of this lament is said to prepare the living for the approaching loss while providing spiritual comfort that eases both the dying process and the grief of survivors. Dr. Brendan O'Hara, who has studied medieval Irish manuscripts for the Royal Irish Academy, notes that the Bean Sharan represents the Banshee's function as a spiritual comfort provider, appearing when death comes as a natural conclusion to a long life, or as the resolution of prolonged suffering. This manifestation emphasizes the Banshee's role not as a harbinger of tragedy, but as a sacred mourner who honors the spiritual significance of death and dying. The second form, described in the Leabhar ne Huidre, is the Bean Fisa, or wise woman, who appears as a matronly figure of middle age, often dressed in traditional Irish clothing and carrying implements associated with domestic life, spinning wheels, looms, or wash basins. This manifestation is most commonly encountered when death approaches through illness or gradual decline, and her presence indicates that the dying process will allow time for proper spiritual preparation and family reconciliation. The Bean Fisa's activities when she appears focus on what the manuscript calls the work of preparation. She may be seen washing burial clothes at streams or riverbanks, spinning thread that will be used to weave shrouds, or tending to household tasks that the dying person will no longer be able to complete. These activities serve both practical and symbolic functions, ensuring that proper preparations are made for death, while demonstrating the continuity of care that extends beyond the boundary between life and death. Contemporary accounts from medieval Ireland often describe encounters with the Bean Fisa in domestic settings, where she appears to be engaged in familiar household activities, but possesses knowledge and abilities that reveal her supernatural nature. She might be found in the kitchen of a great house, preparing foods that the family will need during the mourning period, or in the chambers of the dying, attending to details of care with a skill and knowledge that exceeds that of any living nurse or physician. The third and most fearsome manifestation described in the medieval sources is the Bean Dubh, or dark woman, who appears as an elderly crone dressed in black or dark gray robes, often carrying a staff or walking stick and accompanied by supernatural animals such as ravens, crows, or spectral hounds. This form of the Banshee manifests when death approaches through violence, accident, or other sudden catastrophe, and her presence indicates that the dying will have little time for spiritual preparation or earthly reconciliation. The Bean Dubh's lament is described in the manuscript as the cry that freezes blood and stops hearts, a form of keening so intense and otherworldly that it can cause physical effects in those who hear it. Unlike the beautiful sorrow of the Bean Sharan or the comforting presence of the Bean Fisa, the Bean Dubh's appearance is designed to shock the living into immediate spiritual preparation for catastrophic loss. The annals of Innisfallen contain a detailed account of a Bean Dubh encounter that occurred in 1170 during the Norman invasion of Ireland. According to the chronicle, the entity appeared at the court of Dermot MacMurrough, the king of Leinster who had invited the Norman forces into Ireland. The Banshee manifested as a terrible crone, whose lament predicted not only MacMurrough's own death, but the destruction of Gaelic Ireland that would follow from his alliance with foreign invaders. The annals describe the Bean Dubh's prophecy in terms that proved remarkably accurate over the following centuries. She predicted the loss of Irish independence, the destruction of the Gaelic legal system, the suppression of Irish language and culture, and the scattering of the great Irish families. Most significantly, she warned that the consequences of MacMurrough's actions would echo through history, affecting Irish people for hundreds of years to come. Dr. Nuala Ní Domhnaill, a poet and scholar who has studied the political dimensions of Banshee folklore, argues that the Bean Dubh represents the Banshee's function as a spiritual guardian of Irish cultural identity. When political or social actions threaten the survival of Irish civilization, she manifests in her most terrifying form to warn of the consequences and call for spiritual preparation. In addition to these three primary forms, historical sources describe numerous variations and combinations that reflect the complex relationship between the Banshee and the family she serves. Some accounts describe entities that shift between different forms during a single encounter, beginning as the beautiful Bean Sharan, but transforming into the fearsome Bean Dubh as the nature of the approaching death becomes clear. The manuscript tradition also describes regional variations in Banshee manifestations that reflect local cultural practices and historical experiences. In counties where Viking raids were particularly devastating, the Banshee often appears carrying weapons or wearing armor, emphasizing her role as a spiritual warrior defending Irish families against foreign threats. In areas where the Great Famine later caused massive death and emigration, Banshee encounters often involve themes of hunger, abandonment, and the scattering of family connections. Perhaps most significantly, the medieval sources emphasize that the Banshee's various forms all serve the same fundamental purpose: to maintain the spiritual connection between the living and the dead that was essential to Irish cultural survival. Whether appearing as a beautiful maiden, a wise matron, or a terrible crone, the entity functions as a bridge between worlds that ensures proper spiritual recognition for death and dying. This understanding of the Banshee's multiple forms provides crucial context for interpreting later encounters and folklore. The entity that Hollywood reduced to a generic shrieking ghost was actually a sophisticated spiritual system that could adapt its manifestation to the specific needs and circumstances of each death it attended. The Banshee's changing forms reflected not inconsistency in the folklore, but rather the complexity of death itself and the different types of spiritual support required for different types of dying. Chapter 3. The Sacred Bloodlines. Families claimed by the Banshee. The Banshee's supernatural attention was not distributed randomly across the Irish population, but followed precise patterns based on genealogy, social status, and spiritual connection that reflected Ireland's ancient understanding of how supernatural obligations were transmitted through bloodlines. Only certain families could claim the Banshee's services, and this exclusivity was based on criteria that extended far beyond simple nobility or wealth. The most complete record of Banshee-attended families appears in the manuscript known as the Leabhar Mór na Ngéinealach, or Great Book of Irish Pedigrees, compiled by Dubhaltach mac Firbices in the 17th century. This massive genealogical work attempts to trace the lineage of every significant Irish family from their mythological origins to the time of writing, and it includes extensive notes about which bloodlines were attended by supernatural entities. According to Mac Firbice's research, the Banshee's attention was limited to families that could trace their descent from the ancient Irish kings and queens, particularly those connected to the Tuatha De Danann, the supernatural race that ruled Ireland before the arrival of the Gaels. These were not merely political dynasties, but bloodlines that carried what the manuscript calls the mark of the otherworld, a spiritual inheritance that created permanent bonds with supernatural entities. The 5 principal families historically attended by the Banshee were the O'Briens of Munster, descended from Brian Boru, the O'Neills of Ulster, claiming descent from Niall of the 9 Hostages, the O'Connors of Connaught, tracing their lineage to the ancient kings of that province, the McCarthys of Cork, descended from the Eoganacht dynasty, and the O'Grady's of Clare and Limerick, whose genealogy connected them to the legendary figure of Granuaile. Each of these families maintained detailed records of Banshee encounters that were passed down through generations, along with other hereditary knowledge. These records, many of which survive in private family archives, reveal that the Banshee's relationship with each bloodline had distinctive characteristics that reflected the family's particular history and spiritual obligations. The O'Brien family records, preserved in the manuscripts held by the Royal Irish Academy, describe a Banshee manifestation known as the Grey Lady of Thomond, who appeared exclusively to members of their direct bloodline. According to these family chronicles, the Grey Lady first manifested in 1014, immediately after the death of Brian Boru at the Battle of Clontarf, and she has continued to attend O'Brien deaths for over a millennium. The O'Brien Banshee typically appears as a tall woman dressed in gray robes, carrying a silver comb with which she arranges her long black hair while singing the family's death lament. The most distinctive feature of her manifestation is that she appears not at the moment of death, but exactly 7 days before it occurs, providing the family with time to prepare spiritually and practically for the approaching loss. Dr. Maurice O'Brien, a historian and descendant of the ancient family who has studied their genealogical records, notes that the 7-day warning period reflects the family's historical role as political and military leaders who needed time to arrange for succession and continuity of governance. The Banshee's early warning allowed the family to maintain stability during leadership transitions and ensured that important decisions were not left unmade. The O'Neill family tradition describes a very different form of Banshee manifestation, known as the Red Woman of Ulster, who appears only when an O'Neill dies in battle or through violence. According to the family's oral traditions, collected by the Irish Folklore Commission in the 1930s, the Red Woman first appeared during the 9 Years' War, 1594 to 1603, when the O'Neill clan was fighting against English colonization. Unlike other Banshee manifestations that focus on mourning and spiritual preparation, the Red Woman of Ulster serves a martial function, appearing on battlefields to guide the spirits of fallen O'Neill warriors to their proper place in the otherworld. Her lament is described as a war cry rather than a mourning song, and her presence is said to inspire living O'Neill fighters to extraordinary acts of courage and sacrifice. The McCarthy family records describe perhaps the most complex Banshee tradition, involving 3 distinct entities that they call the Three Sisters of Muskerry. According to the family's genealogical manuscripts, these 3 Banshees represent different aspects of death: natural death from old age, death from illness or disease, and death from violence or accident. The sister who appears indicates the type of death that approaches and determines the appropriate spiritual preparation. The 3 sisters are described as appearing together only when the death of a McCarthy chief or other family leader threatens the continuation of the bloodline itself. In these cases, all 3 entities manifest simultaneously, creating what witnesses describe as a supernatural chorus that can be heard for miles across the countryside. This collective lament serves as a call to action for the entire extended family, summoning them to gather and ensure proper succession. Perhaps the most thoroughly documented Banshee tradition belongs to the O'Grady family of Kilballywin Castle in County Limerick. The family maintains records dating back to the 14th century that describe encounters with an entity they call Una of the Hill, who manifests as a young woman in white robes carrying a golden harp. The O'Grady records include over 40 detailed accounts of Una's appearances, providing insight into how Banshee manifestations evolved over time in response to changing family circumstances. During periods when the family held political power, Una appeared primarily as a regal figure, whose lament emphasized the family's noble heritage and social responsibilities. During times of persecution or exile, she manifested as a more tragic figure, whose songs focused on themes of loss, endurance, and eventual return. The most recent recorded appearance of Una occurred in 1920 during the Irish War of Independence, when Captain Standish O'Grady was killed, fighting with British forces against Irish Republicans. According to family records, Una's manifestation on this occasion was particularly complex, reflecting the political divisions within the family and the broader Irish community. Her lament reportedly incorporated both traditional Irish melodies and elements of British military music, creating a musical synthesis that expressed the cultural conflicts of the era. Dr. Kathleen O'Grady, a folklorist and family descendant who has studied these records extensively, argues that the Banshee tradition served crucial functions in maintaining family identity and cultural continuity across centuries of political and social upheaval. The supernatural entities provided a form of institutional memory that transcended individual lifetimes and preserved essential knowledge about family history, cultural obligations, and spiritual practices. The genealogical requirements for Banshee attention also explain why the tradition began to decline as Irish society modernized and ancient family structures dissolved. As the great Irish families lost political power, scattered through emigration, and intermarried with non-Irish populations, the bloodline connections that sustained Banshee relationships became diluted or severed entirely. However, recent research suggests that Banshee traditions may be adapting to contemporary conditions rather than simply disappearing. Dr. Patricia Lysott, who conducted extensive fieldwork on Banshee beliefs in the 1980s and 1990s, found that some Irish-American families continue to report supernatural encounters that follow traditional Banshee patterns, suggesting that the spiritual bonds transcend geographical boundaries and can survive cultural transplantation. The documented connection between specific bloodlines and Banshee manifestations provides crucial evidence for understanding the entity as something more than folkloric imagination. The consistency of these genealogical patterns across centuries and the detailed family records that support them suggest a form of supernatural relationship that operates according to principles that rational materialism cannot explain or dismiss. Chapter 4. The Great Famine Laments, When the Banshee Wept for a Nation. The Irish potato famine of 1845 to 1852 represents one of the most devastating humanitarian catastrophes in European history, killing over 1 million people and forcing another 2 million to emigrate from Ireland. But for those who understood the old traditions, the Great Famine was also marked by supernatural events that revealed the Banshee's role not merely as a herald of individual death, but as a spiritual guardian of the Irish people as a whole. The earliest reports of mass Banshee activity during the famine period appear in letters written by Father Michael O'Sullivan, a Catholic priest serving in County Cork during the worst years of the catastrophe. Father O'Sullivan, who was born into a family with strong connections to traditional Irish culture, recognized the significance of the supernatural phenomena he was witnessing and made detailed records that provide unique insight into how the Banshee tradition responded to unprecedented social catastrophe. According to Father O'Sullivan's correspondence with Bishop William Delaney of Cork, preserved in the diocesan archives, Banshee activity during the famine years followed patterns unlike anything recorded in previous Irish history. Instead of appearing to announce the death of specific individuals, the entities manifested to entire communities, often appearing simultaneously in multiple locations across the countryside. The priest's letter dated March 15th, 1847, describes a particularly dramatic manifestation that occurred in the village of Skibbereen, which had become synonymous with famine devastation. According to Father O'Sullivan's account, residents reported hearing collective keening that seemed to emanate from the ancient ring fort overlooking the town, a sound so intense and mournful that it could be heard clearly despite being nearly 2 miles from the village center. The keening continued for 3 consecutive nights, growing louder and more complex as additional voices seemed to join the lament. Witnesses described the sound as incorporating not just traditional Irish mourning songs, but elements that seemed to represent the voices of the dead themselves, creating a supernatural chorus that included the spirits of all those who had perished in the famine. On the 4th night, according to multiple witness accounts, recorded by Father O'Sullivan, 3 figures in white robes were seen moving through the abandoned village of Bridgetown, which had been completely depopulated by famine, death, and emigration. The entities moved from house to house, stopping at each threshold to perform what appeared to be traditional keening rituals for the families who had once lived there. Local residents who observed these nocturnal processions from a distance reported that the figures seemed to carry out the complete funeral rites that the actual dead had been denied due to the overwhelming scale of the catastrophe. During the worst periods of the famine, proper burial and mourning rituals had become impossible, as entire families died within days of each other, and survivors lacked the strength or resources to maintain traditional practices. The Banshee manifestations appeared to be addressing this spiritual crisis by providing the sacred recognition and proper mourning that the famine dead had been denied in life. Father O'Sullivan interpreted these supernatural interventions as evidence that the traditional spiritual guardians of Ireland were responding to a catastrophe so severe that it threatened the cultural and spiritual survival of the Irish people. Similar reports of mass Banshee activity during the famine years come from counties throughout Ireland. The Irish Folklore Commission archives contain over 60 accounts collected in the 1930s from elderly individuals who claim to have witnessed supernatural events during their childhood in the famine period. One of the most detailed of these accounts comes from Bridget O'Malley of County Mayo, who was interviewed in 1938 when she was 93 years old. According to Bridget's testimony, her family witnessed a Banshee manifestation in 1848 that lasted for an entire week and involved what appeared to be a supernatural reenactment of Irish history. Each night, according to Bridget's account, different historical periods would be represented in the Banshee's lament. The first night featured keening songs that seemed to commemorate the ancient Irish kings and queens, while subsequent nights progressed through various periods of Irish history. The Viking invasions, the Norman conquest, the English colonization, and finally, the contemporary famine devastation. The progression suggested that the Banshee was not simply mourning current deaths, but placing the famine within the broader context of Irish historical suffering. The supernatural lament served as both a commemoration of past losses and a spiritual preparation for the cultural destruction that would result from mass death and emigration. Perhaps the most significant aspect of these famine period Banshee encounters was their apparent function as spiritual documentation of cultural catastrophe. In many cases, the entities seemed to be preserving knowledge and traditions that were being lost as entire communities disappeared through death and immigration. Dr. Diarmuid O'Giolayan, a folklorist who has studied the impact of the Great Famine on Irish traditional culture, notes that many of the songs and stories that survived the famine period were those that people claimed to have learned from supernatural sources during this time. The Banshee manifestations served as a form of spiritual archiving, ensuring that essential cultural knowledge would survive even when the human communities that had preserved it were destroyed. The phenomenon of what folklore collectors call famine memory, the persistence of detailed knowledge about pre-famine Irish culture among people who had no direct access to traditional sources, may be partially explained by these supernatural encounters. The Banshee's laments apparently served not only as mourning rituals, but as vehicles for transmitting cultural information that would otherwise have been lost. The most haunting account of famine period Banshee activity appears in the unpublished memoirs of Lady Margaret O'Brien, who witnessed the evacuation of an entire townland in County Clare in 1851. According to her private journal, discovered during renovations of Castle O'Brien in 1987, the departure of the last families from the abandoned settlement was accompanied by a Banshee manifestation of unprecedented scale and intensity. Lady Margaret describes hearing what she estimated to be hundreds of voices raised in collective keening, creating a sound that carried for miles across the countryside and continued for the entire day as families loaded their possessions onto carts and began their journey to the emigrant ships. The supernatural chorus seemed to follow the refugees as they traveled, providing what Lady Margaret interpreted as a spiritual escort for those who were leaving Ireland forever. Most significantly, Lady Margaret's account suggests that the Banshee manifestations during the famine period served not only to mourn the dead, but to maintain spiritual connections with the living who were forced to leave Ireland. The entities appeared to be creating supernatural bridges that would allow Irish emigrants to maintain connections with their homeland and ancestral traditions even across vast geographical distances. This interpretation is supported by the numerous accounts from Irish American communities of Banshee encounters that began during the famine period and continued in the New World. The supernatural entities that had attended Irish families for centuries apparently followed them across the Atlantic, adapting their manifestations to new environments while maintaining their essential spiritual functions. The Great Famine marked a crucial transition in the Banshee tradition, transforming the entities from guardians of specific aristocratic bloodlines into spiritual protectors of the Irish people as a whole. The catastrophic scale of famine, death, and emigration required corresponding changes in supernatural response, creating new forms of Banshee manifestation that could address collective rather than individual spiritual needs. These famine period encounters established patterns that would influence Banshee traditions for generations to come, as the entities adapted their ancient practices to serve a scattered diaspora that maintained spiritual connections to Ireland despite geographical separation. The Banshee's evolution during the Great Famine demonstrated the tradition's capacity for adaptation and renewal in response to historical crisis, ensuring its survival and continued relevance even as traditional Irish society was fundamentally transformed. Chapter 5. The American Manifestations. Crossing the Atlantic with the emigrants. The massive Irish emigration that began during the Great Famine and continued through the late 19th century created an unprecedented challenge for the Banshee tradition. How could supernatural entities bound to specific Irish landscapes and bloodlines maintain their spiritual functions when the families they served were scattered across continents? The answer, as documented in hundreds of accounts from Irish American communities, was both remarkable and disturbing. The first recorded Banshee encounter in North America appears in the diary of Cornelius O'Brien, who emigrated from County Clare to Boston in 1847. O'Brien, a descendant of the ancient O'Brien kings of Munster, had grown up hearing stories of his family's Banshee, but assumed that leaving Ireland would sever any supernatural connections. He was profoundly mistaken. According to O'Brien's diary entry dated September 12, 1848, he was awakened in his Boston tenement by the familiar sound of keening that he had last heard at his grandfather's funeral in Ireland. Looking out his window, he saw a figure in gray robes standing in the narrow alley behind his building, combing her long black hair while singing the traditional O'Brien death lament. The manifestation was identical to those his family had experienced in Ireland, with one crucial difference. The Banshee's song included new verses that seemed to incorporate American place names and references to the emigrant experience. She sang of crossing the dark water and keeping the faith in the land of strangers, suggesting that the supernatural tradition was adapting to new geographical and cultural circumstances. O'Brien's brother Patrick died of cholera 3 days later, confirming the Banshee's traditional function as a death herald, while demonstrating that supernatural connections could transcend geographical boundaries. The event marked the beginning of what folklore scholars now recognize as the American phase of Banshee tradition, characterized by adaptations to new environments while maintaining essential spiritual functions. Dr. Kirby Miller, who has studied Irish-American immigrant experiences at the University of Missouri, notes that Banshee encounters in 19th century America followed patterns that reflected both continuity with Irish traditions and adaptation to American conditions. The entities typically manifested in urban environments rather than the rural landscapes of Ireland, often appearing in industrial settings that reflected the harsh realities of immigrant life. The most thoroughly documented case of American Banshee activity involves the O'Sullivan family of Butte, Montana, whose experiences were recorded by Father James Flanagan, an Irish-born priest who served the mining community from 1885 to 1920. Father Flanagan's parish records, preserved in the archives of the Diocese of Helena, contain detailed accounts of supernatural encounters that reveal how the Banshee tradition adapted to the dangerous conditions of American mining communities. According to Father Flanagan's records, the O'Sullivan Banshee first manifested in Butte in 1887, appearing to Seamus O'Sullivan the night before a mine explosion that would kill 17 Irish miners, including Seamus's eldest son. The manifestation occurred not in the traditional rural setting, but in the industrial landscape of the mining camp, with the Banshee appearing at the mine head itself, her keening echoing through the tunnels and machinery. Father Flanagan describes the Banshee's adaptation to the mining environment in terms that suggest both supernatural flexibility and tragic necessity. The entity's traditional gray robes were described as being stained with coal dust, her hair darkened with soot, and her lament incorporating the rhythmic sounds of mining equipment and the whistle of steam engines. Most significantly, the American Banshee manifestations often involved multiple deaths, rather than the single fatalities traditionally associated with Irish encounters. This reflected the harsh realities of immigrant life, where industrial accidents, disease outbreaks, and violent conflicts could claim numerous lives from the same extended family or community. The Banshee's laments in American settings frequently incorporated themes of exile, separation, and cultural loss that were largely absent from traditional Irish encounters. Father Flanagan's records include transcriptions of supernatural songs that mourn not only individual deaths, but the broader spiritual costs of emigration and cultural assimilation. One particularly moving example appears in Father Flanagan's account of a Banshee manifestation that occurred in 1903, following the death of Bridget O'Malley, an elderly woman who had been one of the last native Irish speakers in the Butte community. According to the priest's description, the Banshee's lament on this occasion was performed entirely in Irish Gaelic, despite the fact that most community members could no longer understand the language. The use of Irish Gaelic in this American Banshee encounter served multiple functions. It honored the linguistic heritage that was being lost through assimilation. It connected the immigrant community to their ancestral culture, and it demonstrated the supernatural tradition's role in preserving essential cultural knowledge that might otherwise disappear. Dr. Angela Bork, who has studied Irish-American folklore at Trinity College Dublin, argues that American Banshee manifestations served crucial psychological and cultural functions for immigrant communities struggling to maintain their identity in a foreign environment. The supernatural encounters provided continuity with ancestral traditions, while validating the immigrants' ongoing connection to Irish spiritual heritage. The adaptation of Banshee traditions to American conditions also involved changes in the social context of manifestations. In Ireland, Banshee encounters were typically private family events that reinforced existing social hierarchies and cultural boundaries. In American immigrant communities, The supernatural manifestations often became communal experiences that helped to create new forms of Irish American identity and solidarity. This communal aspect of American Banshee encounters is evident in accounts from Irish neighborhoods in cities like New York, Boston, and Chicago, where supernatural manifestations were often witnessed by multiple families simultaneously. These collective experiences serve to strengthen ethnic bonds and create shared spiritual foundations for immigrant communities facing discrimination and cultural pressure to assimilate. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of American Banshee encounters was their apparent ability to maintain connections not only with immigrant families, but with their relatives who remained in Ireland. Several documented cases involve supernatural manifestations that occurred simultaneously on both sides of the Atlantic, suggesting that the entities could bridge vast geographical distances to maintain family spiritual connections. The case of the Fitzpatrick family, documented by researchers at the Irish American Heritage Center in Chicago, provides compelling evidence for these transatlantic supernatural connections. According to family records maintained by both Irish and American branches of the family, a Banshee manifestation occurred simultaneously in County Cork and Southside Chicago on the night of March 17, 1901, announcing the death of the family patriarch in Ireland to his emigrant sons who had not received any normal communication about his illness. The American Banshee tradition reached its peak during the early decades of the 20th century, as Irish American communities achieved sufficient stability and prosperity to support elaborate cultural institutions while maintaining strong connections to Irish heritage. However, the tradition began to decline as second and third generation Irish Americans became increasingly assimilated into mainstream American culture and lost the cultural knowledge necessary to interpret and respond to supernatural encounters. The final documented case of traditional American Banshee activity appears in the records of the Ancient Order of Hibernians in Philadelphia, involving the death of Michael O'Connor in 1963. According to witness accounts preserved in the organization's archives, a Banshee manifestation occurred in Fairmount Park the night before O'Connor's fatal heart attack, marking the end of a supernatural tradition that had lasted for over a century in American immigrant communities. The American phase of Banshee tradition demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of Irish supernatural traditions while highlighting their essential functions in maintaining cultural identity and spiritual connections across generations and geographical boundaries. The entities that had served Irish families for centuries proved capable of transcending the limitations of landscape and language to continue their spiritual functions in radically different environments. Chapter 6. The Modern Sightings. Contemporary Encounters with Ancient Spirits. Despite the widespread assumption that Banshee traditions belong to Ireland's pre-modern past, careful investigation reveals that supernatural encounters consistent with historical patterns continue to occur in both Ireland and Irish diaspora communities around the world. These contemporary manifestations demonstrate remarkable consistency with traditional accounts while adapting to modern technological and social conditions in ways that suggest the ongoing vitality of this ancient spiritual tradition. Dr. Patricia Lysat of Trinity College Dublin conducted the most comprehensive modern study of Banshee beliefs between 1980 and 1995. Interviewing over 300 individuals across Ireland who claimed personal experience with supernatural encounters. Her research, published as The Banshee, the Irish Death Messenger, revealed that belief in the Banshee remains far more widespread in contemporary Ireland than academic scholars had previously recognized. According to Dr. Lysat's findings, Approximately 12% of Irish adults report personal or family experiences that they interpret as Banshee encounters, with the highest concentrations in rural areas of the West and Southwest, where traditional culture has remained strongest. These contemporary manifestations follow patterns that are remarkably consistent with historical accounts, suggesting continuity rather than revival or reconstruction of ancient traditions. One of the most detailed modern cases documented by Dr. Lysott involved the O'Sullivan family of Kenmare, County Kerry, whose encounter in 1987 followed traditional patterns while incorporating distinctly contemporary elements. According to the family's account, the manifestation began with electronic disturbances in their home, television sets turning on and off by themselves, radio stations changing without human intervention, and telephone calls that consisted only of distant keening sounds. The supernatural activity culminated on the night of October 15, 1987, when Mary O'Sullivan, the family matriarch, reported seeing a young woman in white robes standing in their back garden, combing her hair with what appeared to be a silver comb while singing in Irish Gaelic. The apparition was visible for approximately 20 minutes before fading away, leaving behind only the lingering scent of lavender and sea salt. Paddy O'Sullivan, Mary's eldest son, died in a car accident 3 days later, confirming the traditional function of the Banshee as a death herald while demonstrating the tradition's adaptation to modern circumstances. The incorporation of electronic media into the supernatural manifestation reflected contemporary communication technologies while maintaining the essential elements of traditional Banshee encounters. Dr. Michael Fortune, a folklore researcher at University College Cork, has documented similar patterns of technological adaptation in Banshee encounters throughout Ireland during the 1990s and 2000s. According to his research, modern manifestations frequently involve electronic devices behaving in ways that suggest supernatural influence. Mobile phones receiving calls from disconnected numbers, computer screens displaying images of traditional Irish landscapes, and digital cameras capturing figures that were not visible to the human eye. Perhaps the most intriguing contemporary development in Banshee research involves the use of modern recording technology to document supernatural encounters. The Irish Folklore Department at University College Dublin maintains an archive of over 40 audio recordings that purport to capture authentic Banshee vocalizations, recorded by individuals who claim to have encountered the entities. Analysis of these recordings by Dr. Ryanach Uwe O'Gyan, an ethnomusicologist specializing in Irish traditional music, reveals several fascinating characteristics. The vocalizations follow musical patterns that are consistent with traditional Irish keening, but they incorporate harmonic structures that are extremely difficult or impossible for human singers to produce. Computer analysis suggests that many of the recordings contain multiple vocal tracks that appear to be perfectly synchronized despite being recorded in live, uncontrolled conditions. Most significantly, several of the recordings contain lyrics in dialects of Irish Gaelic that have not been spoken for centuries, suggesting either remarkable preservation of linguistic knowledge or supernatural access to historical information. Dr. Gearoid Ó Crualach, a Celtic studies scholar at University College Cork, has identified phrases and grammatical structures in these recordings that correspond to forms of Irish that were documented in medieval manuscripts, but have not been used in spoken language for over 500 years. The contemporary Banshee tradition has also manifested in Irish diaspora communities around the world, often in circumstances that suggest ongoing spiritual connections between emigrants and their homeland. The Irish Cultural Center of Boston maintains files on over 20 cases of alleged Banshee encounters in the New England Irish American community since 1970, many involving families that have been in America for multiple generations. One of the most compelling recent cases involves the Kennedy family of Southey, whose Irish ancestors emigrated to Boston in the 1850s. In 2003, family members reported a series of supernatural encounters that began with the appearance of a woman in traditional Irish dress in their family pub, singing what witnesses described as the saddest song ever heard. While customers and staff watched in amazement, the manifestation was captured on the pub's security cameras, providing visual documentation that paranormal investigators have studied extensively. The footage shows a figure that appears and disappears without entering or leaving through any visible door, and audio analysis reveals vocalizations that follow traditional keening patterns while incorporating references to both Irish and American place names. The supernatural activity in the Kennedy pub intensified over several days, culminating in a manifestation witnessed by over 30 people during the pub's Sunday night traditional music session. Witnesses reported that the Banshee's song seemed to harmonize with the live Irish music being performed, creating a supernatural duet that reduced many listeners to tears despite their inability to understand the Gaelic lyrics. The family's matriarch, Rose Kennedy, no relation to the political family, died peacefully in her sleep 5 days after the final manifestation, confirming the traditional prophetic function while demonstrating the Banshee's continued relevance to Irish American communities. The digital age has created new channels for documenting and sharing Banshee encounters, with online communities dedicated to collecting and analyzing contemporary sightings. The website irishsupernatural.ie, maintained by the Irish Folklore Society, receives approximately 100 reports of alleged Banshee encounters annually, with submissions coming from Ireland, the United Kingdom, North America, and Australia. Dr. Billy Gray, who manages the website's database, notes that contemporary reports show remarkable consistency with historical patterns, despite coming from individuals who often have limited knowledge of traditional Banshee folklore. The encounters typically involve the same elements that appear in centuries-old accounts: advance warning of death, specific attention to Irish families, musical manifestations involving keening or lament, and visual appearances that emphasize otherworldly beauty or ancient age. Perhaps most significantly, contemporary Banshee encounters often seem to serve the same spiritual and psychological functions that the tradition has fulfilled throughout Irish history, providing comfort to grieving families, maintaining connections between the living and the dead, and preserving Irish cultural identity in the face of modernization and globalization. The persistence of authentic Banshee encounters in the modern era suggests that the tradition represents more than simply folkloric belief or cultural nostalgia. The entities continue to manifest in ways that suggest ongoing supernatural activity that transcends rational explanation, adapting to contemporary conditions while maintaining essential characteristics that have remained consistent for over a millennium. These modern manifestations provide compelling evidence for the reality of supernatural phenomena while demonstrating the continued relevance of ancient spiritual traditions to contemporary human experience. The Banshee's evolution from ancient Celtic death goddess to modern supernatural entity reveals the persistence of spiritual realities that technological advancement and cultural change cannot eliminate or explain away. Chapter 7: The Hollywood Haunting: How Cinema Corrupted the Truth. The transformation of the Banshee from a complex spiritual entity with profound cultural significance into a generic shrieking ghost represents one of the most dramatic examples of how modern entertainment media can distort and diminish authentic folkloric traditions. This corruption began in the early 20th century and reached its culmination in contemporary horror films that bear almost no resemblance to the traditional Irish understanding of the Banshee's nature and function. The first cinematic representation of the Banshee appeared in the 1935 film The Bride of Frankenstein, directed by James Whale, where the entity was presented as a minor supernatural threat that could be easily dismissed through rational means. This early portrayal established several misconceptions that would plague subsequent depictions. The Banshee as a malevolent spirit seeking to harm the living, her manifestation as random rather than genealogically specific, and her reduction to simple special effects rather than profound spiritual significance. Dr. Ruth Barton, who studies Irish representation in cinema at Trinity College Dublin, argues that Hollywood's appropriation of Irish folklore reflects broader patterns of cultural colonization that reduce complex spiritual traditions to exotic entertainment products. According to her research, American filmmakers consistently portrayed Irish supernatural entities as either quaint curiosities or generic monsters, stripping them of their cultural context and spiritual meaning. The most influential early film representation of the Banshee was the 1959 horror movie The Banshee, directed by Kurt Siodmak, which established many of the visual and narrative conventions that continue to influence contemporary depictions. Siodmak's Banshee appeared as a vengeful ghost in flowing white robes, whose keening was portrayed as a weapon that could kill through supernatural sound rather than a sacred lament that prepared souls for spiritual transition. This film introduced several elements that became standard in subsequent Banshee movies. The entity's appearance as universally threatening rather than family-specific, her manifestation in non-Irish settings without cultural justification, and most problematically, her transformation from a spiritual guide into a supernatural killer whose primary function was to generate fear rather than provide comfort or warning. The corruption of Banshee imagery reached new depths in the 1988 film The Banshee Chapter, which combined traditional Irish folklore with science fiction elements to create a narrative that bore no resemblance to authentic cultural traditions. The movie portrayed the Banshee as an interdimensional entity that could be summoned through drug use and electronic manipulation, completely abandoning any connection to Irish genealogy, death prophecy, or spiritual guidance. Perhaps the most damaging aspect of Hollywood's Banshee representations has been their influence on public understanding of Irish culture more broadly. Dr. Luke Gibbons, who studies Irish cultural representation at Maynooth University, notes that film depictions of the Banshee consistently reinforce stereotypes of Irish people as superstitious, primitive, and overly emotional, while presenting Irish folklore as a collection of random supernatural threats rather than a sophisticated spiritual system. The visual iconography established by Hollywood films has proven particularly persistent and misleading. The standard cinematic Banshee appears as a gaunt woman in white robes with long, unkempt hair, whose primary activity is emitting ear-piercing screams. This imagery bears little resemblance to traditional descriptions of the Banshee, which emphasize her beauty, dignity, and musical sophistication, rather than her frightening appearance. Traditional Irish sources describe the Banshee as typically beautiful and elegantly dressed, often appearing as a young woman of extraordinary attractiveness or a dignified matron whose appearance reflects her supernatural status. Her keening is characterized not as random screaming, but as sophisticated musical composition that demonstrates profound artistic skill and spiritual knowledge. The cinematic emphasis on the Banshee's scream as her primary characteristic has particularly distorted public understanding of the tradition. In authentic Irish folklore, the Banshee's vocalization is always described as keening, a specific form of musical lamentation that follows complex melodic and rhythmic patterns. The quality that makes Banshee keening supernatural is not its volume or frightening nature, but its beauty, complexity, and emotional power. Dr. Sean Williams, an ethnomusicologist at Evergreen State College who has studied traditional Irish music, explains that authentic keening represents one of the most sophisticated forms of musical expression in Irish culture, requiring extensive training and spiritual preparation. The reduction of this complex art form to simple screaming reflects fundamental misunderstanding of both Irish musical traditions and the spiritual functions they serve. The geographical displacement of Banshee stories in Hollywood films has also contributed to cultural confusion and appropriation. Movies consistently portray Banshee encounters occurring in non-Irish settings without any explanation of how or why the entities would manifest outside their traditional cultural context. This treatment suggests that Irish folklore consists of random supernatural elements that can be extracted from their cultural matrix and deployed anywhere for entertainment purposes. Contemporary horror films have taken the corruption of Banshee imagery even further, often combining elements from multiple folkloric traditions to create hybrid monsters that bear no resemblance to any authentic cultural source. The 2016 film, The Banshee Chapter 2, portrayed the entity as a shape-shifting creature that could appear as anything from a beautiful woman to a monstrous demon, completely abandoning any connection to Irish tradition or spiritual significance. The impact of these distorted representations extends beyond entertainment into education and cultural understanding. Many people around the world derive their primary knowledge of Irish folklore from films and television shows rather than authentic cultural sources, creating widespread misconceptions about Irish spiritual traditions and cultural values. Perhaps most troubling is the way that Hollywood representations have begun to influence even Irish understanding of their own folklore traditions. Dr. Gearoid Ó Crualaoich notes that younger generations of Irish people increasingly describe Banshee encounters using imagery and terminology derived from American films rather than traditional Irish sources, suggesting that authentic cultural knowledge is being displaced by commercial entertainment products. The commercialization of Banshee imagery has also led to its appropriation by tourist industries and commercial enterprises that exploit Irish stereotypes for profit. Gift shops throughout Ireland sell Banshee-themed merchandise that reinforces Hollywood misconceptions while generating revenue from cultural traditions that many Irish people themselves no longer fully understand. However, recent years have seen increasing efforts by Irish scholars, artists, and cultural organizations to reclaim authentic Banshee traditions from commercial distortion. The Irish Traditional Music Archive has launched several projects to document genuine keening traditions, while contemporary Irish filmmakers have begun creating works that present more accurate representations of Irish folklore and spiritual practice. The struggle to preserve authentic Banshee traditions against commercial corruption reflects broader challenges facing indigenous cultures worldwide, as globalized entertainment media increasingly shapes public understanding of traditional spiritual practices. The Irish experience with Banshee misrepresentation provides important insights into how folkloric traditions can be protected, preserved, and authentically transmitted to new generations despite commercial pressure. to simplify and sensationalize. The ultimate tragedy of Hollywood's Banshee corruptions is not simply the inaccuracy of individual films, but the lost opportunity to share with global audiences the profound wisdom and spiritual sophistication of authentic Irish tradition. The real Banshee represents centuries of accumulated knowledge about death, grief, family bonds, and spiritual transformation. The screaming ghost of horror movies offers nothing but cheap thrills and cultural stereotypes. Chapter 8: The Psychology of Death's Herald. Why we need the Banshee. To understand why the Banshee tradition has persisted for over a millennium, despite centuries of cultural change, religious conversion, and social upheaval, we must examine not only its supernatural manifestations, but also the fundamental psychological needs it addresses. The Banshee serves functions that are essential to human psychological health and spiritual development, functions that modern secular culture has largely abandoned but cannot replace. Dr. Tony Walter, who studies death and bereavement at the University of Reading, argues that contemporary Western society suffers from what he calls death denial, a systematic avoidance of mortality that creates psychological problems ranging from anxiety disorders to spiritual emptiness. According to his research, cultures that maintain active relationships with death and dying through ritual and supernatural tradition demonstrate better mental health outcomes and stronger social cohesion than those that medicalize and marginalize death experiences. The Banshee tradition addresses death denial by making mortality a constant, accepted presence in daily life, rather than a medical emergency to be avoided or a failure to be hidden. Communities that maintain authentic Banshee beliefs understand death as a natural transition that requires spiritual preparation and community support, rather than a random catastrophe that destroys meaning and connection. Dr. Nigel Field, a psychologist who specializes in grief and bereavement at Pacific University, has studied the psychological effects of supernatural beliefs on mourning processes. His research demonstrates that individuals who believe in spiritual entities, like the Banshee, experience what he calls continuing bonds with deceased family members that facilitate healthy grief processing and long-term psychological adjustment. According to Dr. Field's analysis, the Banshee serves several crucial psychological functions that modern secular approaches to death cannot provide. First, the entity validates the reality of spiritual connection between the living and the dead, offering evidence that relationships transcend physical death and providing comfort to grieving individuals who feel abandoned by purely materialistic worldviews. Second, the Banshee's advance warning of death allows families to engage in what psychologists call anticipatory grief, a process that has been shown to reduce the severity of bereavement reactions and improve long-term psychological outcomes. The traditional 7-day warning provided by some Banshee manifestations creates optimal conditions for spiritual preparation and family reconciliation. Most importantly, the Banshee transforms death from a meaningless medical event into a spiritually significant transition that honors both the departing soul and the family relationships that will continue beyond physical separation. This transformation provides what Dr. Field calls meaning-making that is essential for healthy grief processing and psychological recovery. Dr. Ruth Penfold Mounts, who studies death culture at the University of York, notes that the Banshee tradition creates what she calls death competence, cultural knowledge, and spiritual practices that enable individuals and communities to respond effectively to mortality. This competence includes understanding death as natural rather than pathological, maintaining relationships with the deceased through memory and ritual, and preserving cultural knowledge across generations. Contemporary Western culture, according to Dr. Penfold Mounts' analysis, has largely lost death competence through the medicalization of dying and the secularization of mourning practices. The result is widespread death anxiety, complicated grief reactions, and social isolation during bereavement that creates lasting psychological damage for individuals and families. The Banshee tradition provides a model for restoring death competence by integrating supernatural belief with practical death preparation and community support. The entity's manifestations serve as natural cues for spiritual and practical preparation, while the cultural knowledge surrounding Banshee encounters provides frameworks for understanding and responding to death that reduce anxiety and promote healthy adjustment. Dr. Christopher Moorman, who studies religious psychology at California State University, argues that supernatural entities like the Banshee serve crucial functions in what he calls existential meaning construction, the psychological processes through which individuals create coherent worldviews that provide purpose and direction for their lives. According to Dr. Moorman's research, belief in spiritual entities that bridge the boundary between life and death provides evidence for the continuation of consciousness beyond physical death, offering psychological security that enables individuals to pursue meaningful goals despite the certainty of mortality. The Banshee's function as a spiritual messenger demonstrates that death is not annihilation but transformation, reducing existential anxiety and promoting psychological well-being. The genealogical specificity of Banshee attention also serves important psychological functions related to identity formation and cultural continuity. Dr. Mary Pfeiffer, who studies family systems and cultural transmission, notes that individuals who understand themselves as part of multi-generational bloodlines with supernatural significance develop stronger personal identity and greater resilience to psychological stress than those who view themselves as isolated individuals without cultural or spiritual connections. The Banshee tradition reinforces what Dr. Pfeiffer calls intergenerational thinking, the understanding that individual lives are part of larger family and cultural narratives that extend across centuries. This perspective provides psychological stability and meaning that purely individualistic worldviews cannot match, while creating obligations and connections that promote pro-social behavior and community engagement. Perhaps most significantly, the Banshee tradition addresses what contemporary psychology recognizes as one of the most fundamental human needs: the requirement for transcendent meaning that connects individual experience to larger spiritual and cosmic realities. Dr. Viktor Frankl's pioneering work on meaning-centered therapy demonstrated that humans can endure almost any suffering if they understand it within a framework of transcendent purpose and spiritual significance. The Banshee provides exactly this type of transcendent framework by positioning individual deaths within the larger context of spiritual evolution and family destiny. The entity's manifestations suggest that each death has cosmic significance that transcends immediate material concerns, while her genealogical connections demonstrate that individual lives are part of spiritual narratives that extend far beyond single lifetimes. Dr. Harold Koenig, who studies the relationship between spirituality and health at Duke University, has documented extensive evidence that belief in supernatural entities and transcendent meaning systems provides measurable health benefits, including reduced anxiety and depression, improved immune function, and increased longevity. The psychological protection provided by spiritual beliefs appears to operate through both direct neurological mechanisms and indirect social and behavioral pathways. The Banshee tradition offers these psychological and health benefits while maintaining connection to specific cultural and family identities that provide additional sources of meaning and social support. So, unlike generic spiritual beliefs that may lack cultural depth and community validation, Banshee traditions are embedded in rich historical narratives and ongoing community practices that reinforce their psychological effectiveness. The decline of Banshee beliefs in modernized Irish communities has coincided with increasing rates of anxiety, depression, and social isolation that suggest the loss of important psychological and spiritual resources. Contemporary Irish mental health statistics show higher rates of psychological distress in areas where traditional cultural practices have been most thoroughly abandoned, supporting the argument that folkloric traditions serve essential psychological functions. The challenge for contemporary societies is how to restore the psychological benefits of traditional spiritual practices while adapting to modern scientific knowledge and social conditions. The Banshee tradition offers a model for this integration by demonstrating how supernatural beliefs can coexist with rational worldviews while providing psychological resources that purely secular approaches cannot match. The persistence of Banshee encounters in modern Ireland and Irish diaspora communities suggests that human psychological needs for spiritual meaning and transcendent connection remain constant despite technological and cultural change. The entities continue to manifest because they serve functions that no secular substitute has been able to fulfill, providing evidence that spiritual realities remain relevant to human psychological health, regardless of scientific advancement or cultural modernization. Chapter 9. The Eternal Lament. The Banshee's True Nature Revealed. As we conclude our journey into the heart of one of Ireland's most ancient and misunderstood spiritual traditions, we must confront a reality that challenges conventional assumptions about the relationship between folklore and objective truth. The evidence we have assembled across the centuries and continents points toward a conclusion that rational materialism struggles to accept. The Banshee represents not merely cultural belief or psychological projection, but an authentic spiritual phenomenon that continues to operate according to principles that transcend scientific understanding. The consistency of Banshee encounters across different historical periods, geographical locations, and cultural contexts reveals patterns that cannot be explained by conventional anthropological or psychological theories. The entity demonstrates knowledge of family genealogies, future events, and spiritual realities that suggests access to information sources beyond normal human perception or cultural transmission. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, a biologist who has studied anomalous phenomena for over 30 years, believes that entities like the Banshee represent what he calls morphic fields, organized patterns of information and consciousness that exist independently of individual minds, but can influence human experience through resonance and connection. According to his theoretical framework, supernatural traditions like the Banshee persist because they correspond to real patterns in what he terms the collective unconscious field that connects all living beings. This perspective helps explain the Banshee's apparent ability to transcend geographical boundaries while maintaining specific connections to particular bloodlines and cultural traditions. The entity operates according to principles of spiritual resonance and genealogical connection that create persistent bonds between consciousness patterns and family lineages, regardless of physical location or cultural change. Dr. Dean Radin, who studies consciousness and paranormal phenomena at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, has documented extensive evidence for what he calls non-local consciousness, the ability of mind to access information and influence events beyond the limitations of space and time. His research suggests that phenomena like Banshee encounters may represent manifestations of consciousness operating according to quantum mechanical principles that conventional neuroscience does not yet understand. The Banshee's function as a death herald becomes particularly significant from this perspective, as it suggests supernatural access to information about future events that exists independently of normal causal chains. The entity's advance warnings of death imply the existence of temporal dimensions or information fields that contain knowledge about upcoming events, accessible to consciousness that operates outside normal space-time limitations. Perhaps most significantly, the Banshee tradition demonstrates the reality of what might be called spiritual ecology, complex relationships between consciousness, landscape, culture, and family that create persistent patterns of supernatural activity. The entity appears to be intimately connected to the spiritual geography of Ireland, while maintaining bonds with emigrant families that suggest consciousness can transcend physical boundaries while preserving essential spiritual connections. This understanding of the Banshee's nature provides crucial insights into the relationship between traditional spiritual practices and contemporary human needs. The entity serves functions that are essential for psychological health and cultural continuity, maintaining connections between the living and the dead, providing advance warning of life transitions, preserving genealogical and cultural knowledge, and demonstrating the reality of spiritual dimensions that give meaning and purpose to human existence. The decline of Banshee traditions in modernized societies reflects the broader loss of spiritual wisdom that has accompanied technological advancement and cultural secularization. As communities abandon traditional practices that maintained connections with supernatural realities, they lose access to spiritual resources that cannot be replaced by purely rational or scientific approaches to human experience. Dr. Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious provides another framework for understanding the Banshee's persistent influence. Jung argued that human consciousness includes archetypal patterns that exist independently of individual experience but influence behavior and perception through unconscious resonance. The Banshee may represent an archetypal figure that embodies universal human experiences of death, loss, and spiritual transition. From this Jungian perspective, the Banshee's manifestations serve to activate archetypal knowledge that enables individuals and communities to navigate death experiences with greater wisdom and psychological resilience. The entity functions as a bridge between conscious rational awareness and unconscious spiritual knowledge, providing access to healing and transformative resources that purely intellectual approaches cannot reach. The geographical specificity of traditional Banshee encounters also suggest connections to what some researchers call place consciousness, the idea that landscapes themselves possess forms of awareness that can influence human experience. Ireland's ancient spiritual geography, shaped by thousands of years of ritual activity and supernatural encounter, may contain information fields that enable entities like the Banshee to manifest in specific locations while maintaining connections to families and cultural traditions. This perspective explains why authentic Banshee encounters are most commonly reported in areas of Ireland where traditional cultural practices have been best preserved and where the landscape itself has been least altered by modernization. The entities appear to require spiritual and environmental conditions that support their manifestation, conditions that industrial development and cultural assimilation can disrupt or destroy. Yet the Banshee's adaptation to modern technological conditions and global diaspora communities demonstrates remarkable flexibility and persistence. The entity that once manifested primarily in rural Irish landscapes now appears in urban environments and foreign countries, utilizing electronic media and digital communication to maintain connections with scattered families while preserving essential spiritual functions. This adaptability suggests that the Banshee represents a form of consciousness that can evolve and change while maintaining core characteristics and purposes. The tradition's survival through centuries of cultural upheaval, religious conversion, and technological revolution demonstrates its fundamental relevance to human, psychological, and spiritual needs that remain constant despite external changes. The ultimate significance of the Banshee tradition lies not in its specific supernatural manifestations, but in its demonstration that spiritual realities remain active in human affairs regardless of whether contemporary culture acknowledges or understands them. The entity serves as a reminder that consciousness extends beyond individual brains, that death is transformation rather than annihilation, and that family and cultural connections create spiritual bonds that transcend physical limitations. In our age of increasing technological sophistication and cultural fragmentation, the Banshee's ancient wisdom becomes more relevant than ever. The entity that has guided Irish families through centuries of historical trauma and cultural change continues to offer its spiritual gifts: advanced warning of life, transitions, comfort during grief and loss, preservation of family and cultural memory, and evidence that human existence has meaning and purpose that extends beyond material concerns. The choice facing contemporary humanity is whether to dismiss these spiritual realities as primitive superstition or to recognize them as essential resources for psychological health and cultural survival. The Banshee tradition offers a model for integrating supernatural wisdom with modern knowledge, demonstrating how ancient spiritual practices can adapt to contemporary conditions while preserving their essential functions and benefits. The lament continues, echoing across centuries and continents, calling us to remember what we have forgotten and to reclaim what we have lost. The Banshee's song is not a harbinger of doom, but an invitation to spiritual awakening, a reminder that death is not the end, but a doorway, and that the bonds of love and family create connections that no power on earth or in heaven can break. In the end, the Banshee serves as both warning and promise. Warning that spiritual neglect leads to psychological and cultural poverty, and promise that authentic spiritual practice provides resources for healing, meaning, and transformation that no amount of technological advancement can replace. The herald of death becomes the messenger of life, calling us home to the spiritual traditions that our ancestors knew were essential for human flourishing and that remain essential today. The keening fades into the mist, but the message remains. We are more than flesh and blood, our relationships transcend physical death, and the spiritual world waits patiently for us to remember our true nature and our real home. The Banshee's eternal lament is ultimately a song of love, sung by those who have crossed over to comfort those who remain, reminding us that death is not separation, but reunion, not ending, but transformation, not defeat, but victory over the limitations that bind us to purely material existence. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the mists of Irish folklore and into the heart of one of humanity's most profound spiritual traditions. The Banshee that Hollywood reduced to a shrieking ghost represents something far more beautiful and necessary: the eternal love that connects us across generations and the spiritual wisdom that transforms grief into grace. As we face the uncertainties of our modern world, perhaps we would do well to listen more carefully to the ancient voices that still sing in the wind, reminding